Businesses like Walmart are specifically leaving Portland, Oregon. So this is the super woke, super liberal area on the west coast of the United States. Now, Portland is known for having riots, known for having, let's say, corrupt city council, DA, basically corrupt elected officials who allow the city to be tarnished by these different, let's say, we can use the term rebel groups, although they're organized groups who are going against the basic foundations of the United States of America. So groups like Antifa, groups like BLM, we have seen both of these groups, amongst other groups, tarnish local communities. Sometimes they come from outside of the community where they don't even live there, but they come outside from the community and they come into these local communities like in Portland because they see that there's no law and order, there's no rule of law. And they're encouraged to, you can protest, that's part of your First Amendment right, but they riot and they create havoc and they cause billions of dollars in taxpayer damage. And what this does is it targets certain businesses because they claim, Antifa and BLM claim that they have insurance, so it's okay if there's looting and crime. But these businesses see that they're losing money, so they leave these areas. So when you have Walmart, when you have these big conglomerates, or even just local mom and pop shops, which is even worse if they get crushed, but you have these big conglomerates that leave these areas, what it does to these local communities is it reduces jobs in the area because a lot of people rely on these big companies like Walmart, like Target, whatever big box brands are out there, brick and mortar. A lot of people in those communities and big cities rely on these headquarters of companies or just these big, it doesn't have to be headquarters, but remote locations across the United States, and they can't get a job. And so what that does is it lowers the standard of living in those areas because now people don't have the money to sustain themselves. They don't have the money to get a higher quality of living. And in tandem with that, it also discourages any new businesses from coming in there. So now you're basically creating a pocket of nothingness. An example of this is there's a lot of places in the United States called food deserts. And what that essentially means is you have certain locations in the United States, and a lot of rural areas specifically, where there's not that many big companies who come and invest in those areas, and so the local people don't have access to certain resources. In this case, a food desert would be like access to high quality foods, fresh produce, fresh meats, things of that nature. And so you have people who are not only in a lower quality of living, but they can't even get a proper job. I mean, they would have to move across the United States to a separate area, start brand new, and that's not even going to guarantee that they're going to have a job. So when there's chaos, you have people in power and you have elected and unelected officials who are in these positions of power. Now you have a direct relevancy to the people who are in power because you're voting for them. But you also have people who are unelected in different businesses or part of certain boards or the underlings of government, the administrative state, even on a local level, and you can still influence their behavior. Now, what these people in power do is they encourage these acts of violence. Really, it's emotional manipulation because they want to garnish a certain percentage of the local community's votes to gain more power. And just on a state and national level, they want to garnish popularity. So they're secured because they have armed guards. They have, they make a certain amount because they're getting paid by the taxpayer. And they have access to certain resources. But everyone else below them is getting hurt dramatically. And so when you have these elected officials who are really just looking out for themselves, they don't really care about the long-term future of the city that they're in, you get places like Detroit, Michigan, where Detroit, Michigan used to be the number one place to go in the United States, super high standard of living, high localized GDP, and eventually you had factories leave and they went to other areas because it was cheaper, and you had poor political policy. And we're seeing this across the United States with a lot of liberal cities. They're implementing poor political policy, they're taking taxpayer money, and they're spending the money on other things that don't really help the individual. I mean, it's typically you would spend money on infrastructure, which as a percentage of people's revenue would be a very small percentage to attribute to infrastructure, maybe like 15, 20%, but they're taxing people at 30, 40, 50% sometimes. And a lot of that money is going back to the politicians, going to certain institutions, certain organizations, certain NGOs, and the people are not benefiting from that. In fact, the people are living in worse constraints than ever. Even in local cities, if you go nearby, even in really wealthy areas, you might have certain potholes that exist on the road, like a dip in the road, and basic infrastructure like that is not being fixed, even by decent cities, because you have a city council and you have different government employees who are part of that entire system, and they're not utilizing the capital well. They're funding different causes that they should not be funding. It's not productive towards that local city. In fact, it can be counterproductive. And oftentimes, because they're using the ability to emotionally manipulate people, they're able to garnish that vote. And so people have to understand, when you're part of a local community, things may sound nice, but you need to break it down logically and use some critical thinking. What can be applicable here that is actually going to benefit this city? And especially if you want your city to grow, especially if you want your city to be pristine, especially if you want your city to be, you want to have certain access to amenities and resources for the people. This is essential to building what you're really building is a mini civilization. And you want to fortify that civilization with as much high quality infrastructure, as much as high quality resources that you can supply the people with. I mean, that's the basic tendency of being on city council or running a city in general. You're serving the needs of the people within that locale. If you are not doing that by any means, you should not be in city council. You should not be you should not be mayor. I have gone to a few cities and I've seen the mayors and city council act reprehensible. They don't care about what the people want to say. I've seen videos where people go into the city hall building and they'll complain to the board, the city council, and the city council might dismiss them or say, yeah, okay, whatever. And nothing ever changes. So it's one thing to go and protest publicly at the city hall, but it's another thing to go a step beyond that, still civil. And maybe you even want to run for mayor in that city. And oftentimes there will be corruption where you'll even have, because of local PD, they work under the mayor. Sometimes there's a structure of corruption where if you try to run for office, and let's say you have a support system, you may have the local PD coming after you for ridiculous charges, harassment, things of that nature. So this is a very complicated structure, even on a city level. But we talk about federal and national politics all the time. What really matters more, I don't want to say more because it really depends on the issue, but for certain contextual issues, your local politics matters a lot more than the federal and national politics, because it's affecting you at a local level. The city ordinances, what you can and can't do, how your local PD treats people, your fire, EMS, what are the local politicians doing for the people, the tax rates, how lax a regulation on businesses, entrepreneurship, what do the areas look like, where is the development? There are so many things that are involved in a city. And so if we're making businesses leave the area and we're not supplying effective jobs and high-paying jobs at that, or just quality jobs in general for the people, well, you're going to have people move to different cities, and that city will turn into a wasteland. And we see that. The United States was designed to be an experiment by the Founding Fathers. Sure, we have our federal politics, but we also have different states, and states have their own jurisdiction, their own rights. And then within cities, you also have your own jurisdiction, your own rights. And it's all an experiment to see which city and which states will do the best. And people will move to the cities and states that will do the best. The problem is, oftentimes people don't know why they move. And so they move, but they may vote the same way. They may have the same ideology. They don't understand how when they left the previous area, they left because of X, Y, and Z reasons, and they shouldn't allow those reasons to exist again in the new city that they're living in. Unfortunately, that always happens, so it's a constant moving game, right? We have people who have come from other countries to the United States of America because they were fleeing a country that their family had lived in for generations. And that typically happens over and over again, where people have to move to different cities, in this case, different nations, because a previous place is doing more harm than good in terms of prosperity, productivity, and obviously it can get a lot worse than that. You may have to escape as a refugee because your ethnic background or your group is specifically being targeted. And so we want to make cities better than what they are. We have the politics for it. We have the resources for it. We have the people for it. The problem is, who is in leadership? Who is strategizing? Do they have your best interests in mind, or do they have their self-interests in mind? And are they being funded or encouraged by groups outside of them at different tops of hierarchies? Because oftentimes we see that certain DAs are funded, or certain mayors are funded, their campaigns, by external groups who don't really care about that local city. They just care about changing the cities in America to fit their narrative, their ideology.